Alexander's reign of terror. You think you know Alexander the Great? The brilliant general who conquered the known world before turning 30? Wait until you hear what he did to his own men. Because his greatest enemy wasn't the Persian Empire, it was the free will of his own soldiers. And he destroyed it with a brutality that history has tried to bury for over 2,000 years. History remembers a hero. Today, we are going to bury that myth. We are shattering the heroic textbook image of Alexander the Great to reveal the chilling reality of how he controlled his men. We are looking past those grand, sweeping battles to understand exactly how Alexander built an empire not on strategy, but on the absolute, paralyzing fear of his own army. This is a dark, hidden chapter your teachers conveniently skipped, yet it is absolutely crucial for understanding who he truly was. His real war wasn't against the vast Persian Empire or the distant lands of India. No! His true battleground was the psychological subjugation of his own Macedonian veterans. He didn't just want an army of soldiers. He wanted a captivated audience of worshippers who were literally terrified to step out of line. Let's pull back the curtain and look at the calculated manipulator hiding underneath the golden legend. There's a massive disconnect between the noble history we learn in school and the grim reality of his psychological warfare. Textbooks give us a clean, heroic version, right? A brilliant young general bringing civilization to the East. But the brutal truth? His army functioned far more like a terrifying cult than a professional fighting force. He set out to scrape their identities clean. He wanted them to forget the word Macedonian, forget their homes, their wives, leaving nothing but total, unquestioning devotion to him alone. He took the deadliest army on earth and transformed them into a massive column of hostages. To truly lock down his absolute power across the known world, Alexander knew he had to systematically erase his men's proud cultural roots. He replaced their history with a radical, non-negotiable belief that he was not just their mortal king, but the literal divine son of the god Zeus Ammon. The crucial point here centers around a specific cultural act called proskynesis. To the Persians, bowing or pressing your forehead to the floor was simply a standard social protocol, a way to observe rank. But to the proud, free Macedonians, this ritual was strictly reserved for their gods alone. By forcing them to perform this act for a living, breathing man, their former childhood friend, he wasn't just demanding respect. He was intentionally forcing them to commit high treason against their own religion. It was a calculated move to subjugate their minds by demanding absolute sacrilege. Imagine the psychological weight of this for a second. You are watching your king, the guy you grew up with who bled the exact same red blood as you, transform into a foreign deity right before your eyes. He adopts foreign royal dress, claims divine parentage after a mysterious visit to the Siwa oasis, and then he literally demands that his closest childhood friends worship him. The most terrifying part? He criminalized any disagreement. Refusing to recognize his godhood wasn't just an unpopular opinion. It was a fast track to execution. But here's the terrifying psychology behind it. Alexander wasn't just narcissistic. He was paranoid. He had seen his father Philip assassinated by his own guards. He had grown up in a court full of betrayal and political murder. To him, love was a weakness. Fear was the only currency that guaranteed loyalty, and he was willing to drown his entire empire in that currency if it meant staying alive. This absolute intolerance of dissent reveals how Alexander began weaponizing fear against his own inner circle. Once the poison of his manufactured godhood took hold, absolutely no one was safe. Over just a few short years, past loyalty and childhood bonds meant nothing if you refused to kneel. First, in 330 BC, he tortured his cavalry commander, Philotas, under suspicion of conspiracy. Using that confession as a convenient excuse, he then ordered the assassination of Philotas' father, the legendary 70-year-old General Parmenion, a man who was completely innocent and had served Philip II with unwavering loyalty for decades. Then came the brutal murder of his closest friend, Clitus, and the arrest of his own court historian, Callisthenes, simply for refusing to perform the bowing ritual. Fear had become his primary tool of management. But the most shocking event was what occurred at Maracanda. Clitus the Black, the man who had literally severed an enemy's arm to save Alexander's life at the Battle of the Granicus, dared to speak the truth during a drunken banquet. He stood up and reminded the king that the empire was built on Macedonian blood. not divine will. Alexander's response? He grabbed an 18-foot sarissa, a heavy pike made of cornel wood, and drove it straight through his savior's chest. It was a visceral, horrifying message to the entire army. The god will murder anyone who speaks out of turn. If you think this was brutal, wait until you see what he did to an entire army that refused to follow him. Stay tuned, because Chapter 4 is where the myth truly crumbles. Let's fast forward 10 grueling years into their agonizing march. We reach a chilling breaking point at the Hyphasis River. To understand why the deadliest army on Earth simply refused to walk any further, you have to comprehend the brutal conditions they were facing. We are talking about 70 days of relentless monsoon rain. Their leather armor was literally rotting off their bodies, their iron swords rusting away to nothing overnight. They were dealing with jungle rot, rampant dysentery, cholera, and lethal snake bites in their sleep. It was a nightmare, and right across the river loomed the terrifying sight of over 3,000 Nunda war elephants, 15 times the amount they had barely survived fighting at the Hydasps. The psychological and physical toll had finally peaked. What happened next perfectly illustrates their ultimate act of defiance. When Alexander commanded them to march further east, they did not shout, riot, or draw their rusting weapons. They simply stood there in the pouring rain and met his demands with absolute, deafening silence. It was not a mutiny in the traditional sense. It was an excommunication of a god. By refusing to move, they stripped him of his psychological control. In one profound, silent moment, faced with this impenetrable wall of silence, the god agreed to turn back, but his retaliation would be unimaginably cruel, proving he never forgave their defiance. He enacted a chillingly calculated punishment. Instead of taking the safe, well-supplied coastal route home, he deliberately marched his army straight into the Gadrosian Desert. This is a 600-mile wasteland of towering sand dunes and 120-degree heat that had famously destroyed the army of Cyrus the Great 2 centuries earlier. He allowed the vulnerable civilians and camp followers to be swept away in flash floods or die of thirst first. Then, he simply watched his highly disciplined veterans starve, hallucinate, and murder each other for a few drops of muddy water. Let's look at the real numbers. According to the ancient historian Arrian, out of the enormous multinational force of roughly 120,000 soldiers and civilians that marched into that wasteland, only about 1/4 of that number, a mere 30,000, staggered out the other side. In other words, 75% of the entire human column that entered that desert were completely wiped out. This single decision killed more of his own people than all of his enemies across a decade of warfare combined. He proved his absolute power by showing he was perfectly willing to destroy them all, rather than let them forget who held the leash. Now, there is a very famous, heroic myth from this march. You might have heard it. A scouting party found a tiny amount of water, brought it to him in a helmet, and Alexander selflessly poured out into the sand to share their thirst. But let's deconstruct that. It wasn't selfless leadership. It was a theatrical performance by a tyrant. The god couldn't drink while his worshippers thirsted, yes, but he was the absolute author of their suffering. He orchestrated their unimaginable agony just to perform this little miracle of solidarity and reassert his absolute dominance over their minds. To put this into perspective, in one single desert march, Alexander killed more of his own people than the United States lost in the entire Vietnam War. And he did it on purpose, because in his mind, a god does not ask for obedience. A god demands it and crushes anyone who refuses. Which really leaves us with this final, provocative question. After witnessing the erased identities, the murdered friends, the forced worship, and a desert march deliberately designed to slaughter his own people, was Alexander truly a god among men? Or was he simply a tyrant who perfected the art of psychological terror? Here's a question I wanted to answer in the comments. If you were a Macedonian soldier, starving in that desert, and you watched your king pour out that water right in front of you, would you have seen him as a selfless leader or a manipulative sociopath? Keep questioning the pristine narratives of history, and we will see you in the next one.